To start today's proceedings, I'd like to introduce our first panel chair, Ross Fairley, partner at Burgess Salmon, working in our energy team, who will explore the strategic thinking on interaction and collaboration between energy and transport sectors in decarbonisation. And I'll let Ross introduce the other panellists too. Thank you, Ross.
I'm hoping this is on. Yes, it is. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bryony. And welcome to this first session, which is a very high-level session with some more drilled-down pieces as Bryony advertised throughout the day in relation to specifics like EVs, hydrogen, energy needs, and so forth. So we are going to try and keep this first one relatively high level, and it's entitled Strategic Thinking, Energy and Transport Links. And I'm delighted to be joined here on the stage with Lily Matson, TfL, Claire Miller, who's a consultant now, but was previously working and still does work part-time for Octopus Electric Vehicles, Liam at the end there with the Energy Systems Catapult, and Michael Hurwitz of PA Consulting. Thank you very much for participating in this. The panel are well briefed. They're expecting some challenging questions and they're prepared to argue with you as well. So please put your questions on Slido. We will watch them as they go up and I will keep an eye on this. Just on timing, you'll note we started late because of the minister run over. We will try and recapture some of the time, but we'll probably go on for 5 minutes longer. I hope that's okay with you because we've got a good panel here and I don't want you to miss out on that. Just by way of background for myself, Bryony introduced me. I did head up our energy team at Burgess Salmon, but more recently I'm chair of our net zero services to clients. And we recognised at Burgess Salmon that net zero and the sectors in which we really specialise, which are particularly actually energy and transport, working together is absolutely key to achieving net zero. I was fascinated by the opening speeches this morning. Everyone is talking about transport in the context of net zero. Now, when I attended big transport conferences, including predecessors to this, going back 5 years ago, the whole idea of decarbonisation and net zero was a sideshow in one of the side theatres. Now it's first and foremostly the biggest thing that everyone is grappling with, and it's encouraging to see that. And we need to take a step back because obviously decarbonising transport is one aspect of net zero. But if we can succeed in decarbonising transport, then it's a big, big step on the way for obvious reasons. And if you like, it's a classic test of our commitment as a whole to net zero is if we can actually do this, because it does involve two of probably the biggest sectors that are going to need to work together to achieve that. Okay, so look, let's without further ado, let's kick off. I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves very briefly, tell you what they're up to, and also what's top of their mind. What's the thing that's really they're thinking about when they think about this session. If I could ask them to do that in maybe 2 minutes, that would be great. Lily.
Yeah, thank you. Morning, everyone. Really great to see so many of you here. I'm Lily Matson. I'm the Chief Safety, Health and Environment Officer for TfL. And what that means most relevantly for this morning's discussion is I'm responsible for TfL's journey to net zero as an organisation. So lots of challenge there, lots of experience to draw on for this discussion. We are the largest electricity consumer in London and obviously responsible for moving London every day in terms of public transport. So I'll really try to bring together those two experiences in my questions and answers. I think what's top of my mind for today is really to make sure that we are, just as Rachel said in her introduction, really thinking about this as a system and in terms of the outcomes we want to achieve. We're really clear in terms of our strategy that we want to help London move by giving people the best sustainable transport option. And that doesn't mean a specific option or a specific electric vehicle. So let's think about this as systems and think about it in terms of the outcomes we're trying to achieve.
Thank you very much, Lily. Claire.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Claire Miller. I was at Octopus for over 4 years full-time. So I delivered at the same time a project called Power Loop, which was a domestic vehicle-to-grid trial. So I learned a lot about energy and how we can use vehicles as batteries on wheels. I was also a member of the founding team of the EV leasing business. So I learned a lot about how you lease vehicles and finance them and actually bringing those two things together. So this is a real pleasure to be on this panel talking about transport and energy coming together, because that's what I've spent the last several years looking at. And now I'm working with a range of startups and established organisations thinking about bringing new technologies to both the energy and kind of transport areas. So to your point about the what's the important thing to keep in mind? Actually, one of the questions that's popped up has kind of stolen my thunder, which is, thinking about the grid and thinking about how fast things are going to go. And it's not just electric vehicles. And this was a point that Ross was keen to make in the prep for this, which is it's not just electric vehicles, but it's all modes of transport. So obviously we talked about the tube and the buses, there's aviation, there's maritime, rail and we go on. So thinking about how the grid comes together with these different modes of transport and how we tie that together with the grid, which is, decarbonising at pace. The UK is a leader in decarbonising our grid. How do we bring all of these different modes of transport and this grid decarbonisation together to do the most with the grid we've got right now, and to make sure that the pace of expanding the grid is balanced with the pace of expansion of all these other potential storage and exporting devices? So that would be my one.
Thank you very much, Claire. Michael.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Michael Hurwitz, partner at PA Consulting, focus on the energy transition with a particular emphasis on mobility. I guess before that, I was in national government, set up OLEV, OZEV, spent some time at TfL, spent some time in an EV startup. So I've been in this space for a while. Top of my mind is how do you deal with this transition, both to make it technologically robust and commercially robust? Because I think often you'll see like an advocate in an organisation fighting the good fight, trying to get a new idea put through. But I guess what I'm really interested is, how do you get to the CFO and take this decision robust, permanent, long-term, something that makes sense both environmentally and commercially for business?
Thank you very much, Michael. And last but not least, Liam.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Liam Lidstone. I head up the clean tech division at the Energy Systems Catapult. That team has sort of specialists in different parts of the energy system, the energy sector, so covering everything from renewables, networks, energy storage, all the way down to the end consumption sectors as far as the energy system is concerned, which includes obviously transport. It's a really important part, and supposed to answer to your question from the Energy Systems Catapult's point of view, is that systems thinking is sort of forefront of thinking in how we plot a course towards addressing decarbonisation, how we can help to address that in a way that actually generates commercial opportunities for UK businesses in particular. And I think one of the key things I would like to sort of see happen at some point is a move away from, move beyond effectively talking about, well, we need to have these conversations, we need to have these links, to it, it becoming a cliche and effectively it moving on to the point where we don't talk about it because it just happens. And I think that's a real, something to strive for.
Thank you very much. Right. So we've had a few questions in, and we're not going to ignore them, but there's a macro one I'd quite like to just set the scene with as well, and it kind of picks up on what Liam's just said about where we hope to get to in the future in this link between energy and transport. Let's just take a step back and say, well, possibly five plus years ago, we weren't even thinking properly really about the interactions between energy and transport. We knew that transport needed to decarbonise, but perhaps the thing that had been neglected from the transport sector was the thoughts about how energy is going to contribute to that and what they needed to do on that. So I'd like us just, and maybe I'm going to ask Michael this, but please, panel, if you want to follow on, please pitch in with your thoughts. State of play right now, what progress, where are we now in the scheme of the links being established and properly working? Michael.
I'm going to take it further back than 5 years. So I had the privilege of working in central government when all of this was kicking off in the days of the Climate Change Act, and at the last British Motor Show, which was in 2008, it was the then Prime Minister Gordon Brown. We got all of the heads of the automotive companies in the UK to meet with all the CEOs of the energy companies in the UK, which was basically, you all need to speak to each other, and they all thought we were nuts. Absolutely nuts, and it was the CEO of SSE at the time, Scottish and Southern. He said, the only time I've ever spoken to you as a company before is when I'm buying your vans, right? And so then, actually the progress is quite significant. It's become a nothing. It's become something that made no sense to a sideshow to be central. And I think in investment terms, I think what you've really seen in the past probably 3 years is what was a kind of strategic investment or potentially an angel investment with the greater certainty on policy, with the greater certainty on technology. It's becoming an investment with a return. So people are now starting to invest because they can see a point when it's going to actually start to be so expanded that it starts to provide returns. What I would say it needs to go next, it is this point about how you bring it together commercially. But at the moment we talk about transport and energy. It has to be a triangle, not just a dichotomy. It has to be transport, energy, and place and physical development. I think that's the place where it needs to go next. How are we going to share those investment costs and share the returns that we get between 3 sectors, not just 2?
Thank you, Michael. Lily, you had something to say.
Just to add that, and I think to think back at the systems level, where I think there has been progress, and if you take a city like London over the last 20 years, there's been sustained shift away from the use of the private car. So if you're talking about decarbonisation, this is actually about how people live and travel every day. And you can demonstrate that, there is a lower carbon lifestyle being lived in that city now per individual than there was 20 years ago. I think our ability, and I think John Armett picked this up in his introductory remarks, to have that same integrated approach at a national level is not actually happening as much. And we need to think about how we really make those integrated choices, and it does include regulation and demand management as well. That's not the end point. That's part of actually how you influence people's choices. So the technology is really important, but it's actually about the system driving the right outcomes, which have to be less carbon-intensive lifestyles.
Okay, thank you very much. And what I'd like to move on to is, because of the links, we've got representatives here, obviously from the public sector, quasi-public sector. We've also got your good self, Claire, from who's been with Octopus EV on the private sector. What is the public sector? What has the public sector got to do now? What's its role in facilitating the mindset, the changes, the links to progress this to the next level?
Should I pick that up? Yeah, okay. I think we've got a huge responsibility and role, both in looking at sort of how you directly address sort of scope 1 emissions through to wider influence, as I've been indicating, in terms of how the choices people make. But if we just take energy and transport very specifically, as I said in my introduction, Transport for London is the largest consumer of electricity in London. We purchase about 1.6 terawatt hours a year. That's an enormous amount. Our ability to influence the market is very significant. If you marry that with the work that Network Rail is doing, that other large purchasers like the Ministry of Defence, and start to think about across the public sector, how can we really work together to make sure that we have a really flourishing renewables industry in this country. I think we have a lot of power. We are currently out to market with our first power purchase agreement to secure around up to 200 gigawatt hours in renewables. And then we'll be working with all the functional bodies in London to do that. So I think there is there's such demand, and we're in a way such good people to partner with in terms of having secure, consistent, long history in terms of requiring those supplies, that we can really underpin the markets and the future development of renewables. So I think it's really exciting, but I do think it requires collaboration and making sure that we don't end up just competing with each other for the same contracts.
That's great, thank you. Can I ask someone else from maybe just pick up on it's still from the public sector, what the role is? Is there any? Yep, please.
Just to add to what Lily said, I think there's two really crucial elements for the public sector to play a role. One is to look at its own estate, its own assets, its own operations, and to say, well, what is it can we do with our services, and then also how we engage with our supply chains, etc., to decarbonise and be consistent with those goals. Because that in itself is a way of setting a great example. It's also a way of seeding some of the development of the supply chain to sort of help. It's a way of sort of coalescing different actors who wouldn't necessarily work together on certain things to sort of come together around certain things. The other element is around effectively establishing and helping to grow the platform on which everyone else can then decarbonise. The market can operate. The market can innovate faster, better, once everyone knows the rules of the game. people can learn to play it better and faster and be more innovative in that way. And I think the public sector has a huge role in sort of setting that, government obviously particularly in setting the rules and the guidelines around that. And that's got to be it has to be in consultation with industry. It's got to be in consultation with those people who can deliver that innovation, because they want rules and guidelines, etc., that will allow them to innovate. And government needs to have those conversations to enable that to happen. But I think it's absolutely really crucial that that's a core role for the public sector and government to help set those foundations.
Okay, thanks for that. So now I'm going to turn to the private sector, because one of my big beefs in all of this is we always, and I'm very guilty of this, push the onus back on government, back on the public sector. It's your problem, you sort it, you need to set the rules and so forth. But there's a big role here and a big responsibility for the private sector and others to take on, and if necessary, fill a void if it's there as well, if we're going to succeed in all of this. So Claire, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I'll pick up on what Liam said actually around the rules of the game, and I think actually that's the one of the challenges at the moment for the private sector, because actually there's a huge amount of investment coming in, but there's a huge lot more pent up, and actually one of the challenges I think we have right now, and it's maybe I'll squeeze in a fourth around time as well as place for these things, which is right now we're at a point in time where there's a lot of promises around public investment coming, and that means there's a lot of private investment money waiting for that to be deployed before they will sort of pile in with the hundreds and hundreds of millions behind. And I think, it's great to see progress on things like the Levi Fund, because until that money is deployed and a portion, so this is on-street public charging, or Levi plus Aux, we're not going to see the public funding kind of coming in. So I think that's an important one about where government has promised money. We need to see the money, and we need to see the deployment of the money, and that's when you start to see the private money coming in from that perspective. And then I guess the other point, just on this high level around the rules of the game, is around technology selection. So we can see, we talked about EVs. I think the EV conversation is over. Apologies, anyone in the room who's very attached to the Toyota Mirai or hopes to have tanks of hydrogen sloshing around in the back of their car. But that conversation is very, very live for heavier vehicles. So for heavy goods vehicles, we don't have a consensus yet on a technology selection. In the UK, the government is very neutral. And so the Transport Select Committee came out with their most recent report saying, actually, by being very neutral on technology, it's not helping that part of the world think about how they're going to decarbonise. And decarbonising heavy freight in the UK is going to be really important. So I would say the rules of the game are very important to what Liam was saying. And it's very important in giving the market confidence to actually know what they're going to do. Now, I guess my third point would be from a consumer perspective, putting on my kind of octopus hat. When I think about that octopus customer, and it's great to have those early adopters, but they are very early adopters, and a lot of them are very tech focused, and they're very keen and happy to, have experiences which are bumpy and difficult, and they almost relish the bumpy, difficult experience because they're pioneers and early adopters, and that's great. We need them, but actually, these products and services that are coming need to be for the mass market. And we are not really even into the early majority of adoption for EVs yet. So I think the private sector is, there are leaders, but it's risky, it's expensive, and it's still not clear, I think, for a lot of the energy firms, utilities, kind of how they get to that, even that early majority, let alone kind of the late majority and the laggards. So I think we're quite early in the journey on the private sector, but I think, there's consumer demand is growing, and that's what will ultimately encourage the private sector in, right? It's the customers want it and demand it. And if they don't get what they want from their incumbent, then they'll switch, whether that's EVs, buses, trains, whatever, they'll make choices around that. So.
Okay, thanks. Look, what we're going to do is move to some of the questions here. And my tech colleagues up there, one of the things we've got here is beyond a couple of lines, you don't get the full question coming up on the screen. So some people are making comments, which I assume is then leading to a question, but it's quite difficult to see that. I don't know whether we can see that, but of the ones that we can see, let's have a look at this. This is quite an interesting one. Does the transport industry, and this is about working together, obviously, share enough data with the energy sector as a key energy user? Does anyone want to pick up on that one? It feels like a Liam or Michael one.
Michael, do you want to start now?
Well, I'll start with saying no way.
Yeah.
No way. And so you're talking about customer, actually getting under the skin of of how an operation works, what is important to an operation. I was always really struck. It was in my last job, actually. Spent quite a lot of time with UPS, the delivery firm. It's so optimized. It's so optimized there. Every second really matters, to the point where they train the drivers to turn the ignition on at the same time as putting on the seatbelt, because it saves them a handful of seconds. It is that optimized. And that's the kind of level of granularity that is meaningful for an operational business. And if you transport that into energy, well, exactly when are people going to be charging? How much? What's their duty cycle? What's the impact? What hill am I going up? What does that mean for the state of charge when they come back? And what you need is a far more open and transparent and reliable way. And one of the key issues is that, traditionally, everyone has their own preferred logistics and telematics systems. So that platform that allows the brokering and the sharing of information to a level of operational granularity, I think exists in some places, and some people are trying to create the platform. But that's another area. There's a long way to go from a commercial point of view. But Liam, that was my intro.
It's a great, all-encompassing intro. I'd absolutely agree, but I think it's both ways. So I don't think the energy sector is sharing enough information with the transport sector either around various things. To give a couple of examples of sort of specific examples where the transport sector could share more information that would be useful for the energy sector. So things like information about state of charge of batteries. That's not something that's necessarily particularly available that would be incredibly useful for the energy sector to have access to. Obviously, all of the different car manufacturers have sort of different algorithms and protocols for calculating that and means for and there are obviously privacy considerations to make around that. But there are frameworks and from other sectors. So something akin to the open banking initiative, if something akin to that could be applied to the transport sector, those sorts of things. Likewise, the energy sector in terms of information about the cost of putting or connecting to the grid in certain places. There are efforts to improve that, but until recently, and to some extent still, there's still a question. You don't know how much it costs until you make an application in a particular location. That's really, really unhelpful for a transport operator. They want to understand, where's the best place for me to put charging or refueling or whatever it happens to be in that is also consistent with my duty cycle. But I don't know how much it's going to cost in a lot of places unless I go through the process of making an application in a particular location. Then I get the answer back. I go, oh, no, that's not good enough. I've got to go somewhere else. And then there isn't yet widely available data in both directions. They're just two examples, I think, and I think there are lots of other examples we could talk through.
Okay, thanks. I'm making the best I can of the questions here. Some of them are relating specifically to some of the energy needs and grid and so forth. We've got a session on that later, so we might touch on that. But if we don't, we can raise that in the sessions later on. So excuse me if we don't tackle that one. I suppose there's an interesting one here, and it picks up on something I think will be interesting to hear the panel's views on. We've talked a lot about electrification. Indeed, Claire was mentioning that the horse has bolted in relation to cars. I'm not sure we'd all agree on that, but the point here is we're banking on electrification as we clearly need to a significant extent. But are we setting ourselves up to fail? There's a question here about 100% reliance on the grid. Well, does it all come down to electrification? Should we be looking at other ways? And even if we're looking at electrification now, are we absolutely sure that we're future-proofing the decarbonisation of the transport sector by heading down this electrification route on a sort of hell-bent focus? Lily.
Yeah, because I think we'll pick up different elements. I love this question. I think we could be heading for failure. I mean, I think one of the things to remember is, so at the system level, what are we trying to do to help people get about their daily job? And, encouraging active travel. There was a further question. You can't see all the questions, but there was a further question about active travel. Active travel is a really important part of the decarbonisation journey. So there's got to be, some of this is about powering vehicles, but most transport conferences get very focused on the technology side, and it is important. I will come to that. But we need to make cities and places functions in ways that don't always rely on anything to do with the grid. They're powered by people through active travel, or by making those locations work in themselves in ways that require much less travel. On the grid side, I do think there's some real, we are facing some potential constraints in getting where we need to with buses. We've got the largest bus network in Europe, 9,000 buses, heading towards 1,000 electric buses this year. We need to get to 2030 with funding, we will, but we know that grid supply will be a constraint on that. So we keep our options open in terms of other technologies, but essentially the roadmap is electric, so we really need to work through that and tackle those constraints. And I wouldn't say we have all the answers on that at all. I think there's something much more that we need to think about how we use, if you think about that battery combined capacity for London when you're looking at 9,000 buses, actually how does that play into an energy system? And we're not at that level of that conversation yet, and we need to start having that much more effectively.
Thank you. Claire, did you want to?
Yeah, that definitely kind of leads on to a reflection on that, which is thinking at a system level, seeing different modes of transport as an opportunity to interact with the grid in ways it hasn't done before is really important. So, we often take for granted our grid and how reliable it is, and also the fact that the grid is designed and is evolving to meet the needs of the country. And so it's not a static thing where, will this grid that we have today meet this need in the future? It's a constant kind of planning and mapping. There's also work going on, and I'm sure the folks here will probably know better than a more transport-focused audience, which is around National Grid ESO becoming National Grid FSO. So this future system operator, and how does the future system operator think about a heavily decarbonised grid, electrified transport and heat, dare I mention it, another massive challenge around heating in the UK. And how does the regulator support that Ofgem, and what is the government's role? So at the higher system level, come and must become an integral part of the grid. And exactly to what Lily was saying, I feel like we're in one of those panels where everyone just violently agrees with each other. But the potential storage capacity in all of these different vehicle batteries and actually static storage and other novel storage technologies, they all have a part to play in the grid of the future. So I think, could it happen? Yes. Is it likely to happen? No. Why? Because we are collaborating, and this kind of conversation is so important in that, because we don't have long. We have sort of the next sort of 5 to 10 years of intense activity to bring this together.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think just to sort of put two things in context around that. So from an energy system point of view, we were talking about whether there's the capacity to cater to this. If we're to hit the net zero decarbonisation targets by 2050, we need to between double and triple the size of the electricity system, and that's with efficiency improvement. And alongside that, we also need a hydrogen supply system, which is equivalent in size to today's electricity system, but we don't really use hydrogen for energy usage in any meaningful way today. So they're both, in their own right, huge challenges. Overall, that's lower energy consumption, but with lots of efficiency improvements and those sorts of things. And when we look at the different modes of transport alongside that, and what that means, yes, there's definite advantage in for cars and vans with electric vehicles. For a lot of the other sectors, it's less clear cut, but it's also less apparent that it's one single solution for each. And looking at, take road freight, for example, it may become less about having a road freight fuel solution, and then rather than looking at particular duty cycles for the different routes and whether they are return to base or whether they are long haul and the types of load they carry. For marine and aviation as well, alongside that, you have a whole different set of considerations as well. Aviation's general sort of public position around this is, they have to look at the different length of the flights, and electric aircraft may well be a possibility, but really it's sort of short stop. Long haul, they really don't have anything that's not what is being termed sustainable aviation fuel, which may come from hydrogen or may come from other routes. So it will be less clear-cut, whereas now we currently have a single fuel for each of those sectors. It might be there'll be multiple fuels for those sectors to meet the different needs of the different sort of sub-sectors within that.
Okay, thanks, Sam. There's a few questions around this. Sorry if I'm not taking them exactly, but I think you'll recognise the subtext in the broader question that I'm asking the panel, and I might come to Michael on this one actually. I'm pleased you mentioned the other forms of transport there. We've talked about the public sector help getting together. We've talked about the private sector and what role they can do. The whole link between energy and transport needs to be made in the mind and be in the mind of the consumers, the customers, the public. How is that going to happen? Are we going to see that happen, and when are we going to see that happen? And I suppose, what do we need to do to promote that in the minds of those participants? Michael?
So is the question about customers specifically?
I think so, but it's also the general public as well. You know, how am I going to be persuaded? I mean, I'm in this sector, so I ought to be persuadable. But you know, how am I going to be persuaded to switch my mode of transport? And then how am I going to be persuaded to look at it not from the perspective of a mode of transport, but as an energy form as well, as a transport form, looking at my bills in total, as opposed to, oh, this is my energy bill. What am I going to do about the car that I drive, and so forth?
Yeah, so it goes without saying that you need to start thinking about the system differently, and it's really hard. It's actually very, very hard, because this is an industry that has grown up. You know, our values about how, you know, the in terms of, you know, psychology, the scripts that we have about fueling a vehicle, you know, probably involve buying some minstrels or something at the, you know, and actually the shift is quite stark, and I think, you know, at the end of the day, the goal is to create the customer pull for this. You know, there's a way, you know, and I come back to what you were saying, Lily, you know, start from what's the life you want to live. You know, so there is a role for everybody on education, for public sector, for the companies that are promoting this, to kind of see what they can do to spread that message out. But it is very, very hard. I think what I would just put in as a challenge is that the risk that being in a conference like this, in a room like this, with like-minded individuals, is that we're all, you know, we all kind of are pushing towards the same thing. I think we all owe it to ourselves to put us out of this comfort zone. So, yeah, one of the things that I took out from being in startup Arrival, you know, which I hope they still make it. But one of the most valuable things was deliberately putting people together who don't normally talk together and work together. Because for a lot of people, the idea of going to electric or to hydrogen for certain circumstances is utterly irrelevant. It is utterly irrelevant. And I think for all of us, there's probably a challenge that we can all take out from this room, is to say, right, go and talk to a set of stakeholders that think you're nuts and understand what's making them tick. Because, you know, we're going to have to get to the laggards and the resistors in this transition. And I think none of us actually invest enough in understanding the customer journey of the people just ahead of where we currently are. How are we going to go for the big prize of getting the people for whom this is currently, you know, very, very challenging? I want to chuck one thing in. Somebody I know, a lady called Erin Baker, writes extremely articulately about the differences in male and female purchasing. Just written a really interesting blog about how still the automotive industry is talking blokey language to blokey customers that they still think are going to buy it, and are completely alienating half their market. And, you know, everyone is guilty of it, and I think we all owe it to ourselves to try think outside our traditional customer base.
Thanks, Michael. Lily?
No, just briefly to add on to that, I think there is in this a particular role of the public sector to try to shape the context in which people are making those decisions. Rachel Skinner in her introduction said something interesting about the friction, how much friction there is or not in terms of changing your behavior. And I mean, you know, if you're wanting ultimately for the right climate or social outcomes, people to make different purchasing choices or different travel choices, then that is both about making the right choices really easy and really attractive and really safe. But it's also about thinking about what's the right regulation that might put friction in the system and make some of the wrong choices less attractive And that's where it does get really difficult, because you have to bring people with you on why the bigger gain is worth it. And there's plenty of debates going on in London around that right now. But you know, this is not outside politics. This is, you have to have a real strong vision of what you want to achieve and why it's important.
Thanks very much. I fear we're virtually out of time, and there's been loads of questions here, so thank you very much. Please hold those questions, because I think some of them can fit into the sessions we've got for the rest of the day here, so have no fear in re-asking them in those sessions. Please do. I encourage you to do so. I think what I'd like to do is just end, please, with just going around the panel here and just asking the panel, if there's one thing that's top of your mind to change, something that could be done now or should be done now, what should it be? It's a pretty tough question, but if we can have ideas from the four of you, that would be great. So where should I start? Shall I start down the other end this time? Liam, put you on the spot first.
Thank you. I think one thing would be really, really valuable to have would be the collective set of industries, involved sectors, to have really a sort of a shared vision roadmap about what it is they want to achieve first. So getting as we've been saying, getting those people in the room, but getting them actually on the same page about what it is they see as the future and getting some agreement around that. I think that would be
Thank you. Michael.
I'll give you one principle, but I'd like it to happen in lots of places. So I guess it's a call out to business leaders, really, in the traditional sector silos, be that transport, be it energy, be it place. Is there one for time? I don't know. To start thinking about what are the new capabilities they need for their businesses. So if they're in the transport world, what else do they need to effectively be able to interact with the energy worlds? What's the data that needs to be in place to allow those two worlds to mediate? So really, I'd like everybody to be thinking more broadly about the capabilities and skills they need for this transition.
Like it. Okay, Claire?
I'll say people. So whether it's, from a transport perspective, we talk about, customers, they're people at the end of the day. And from an energy perspective, these are not energy assets, they're cars or they're whatever. So really thinking about putting people at the heart of all of this. We're all consumers. I think, Michael made a really good point as well about, get out of your comfort zone. I've had a few of, experiences where something that you're working on, or maybe something you're quoted in, gets picked up in a paper that you wouldn't necessarily read. Read the comments, hold your nose, be brave. It's painful, but it's very, very eye-opening. And think about those people and how we're going to bring them all along on this, because ultimately people need to be on board with this. We can't force them all along the way. They have to be part of this.
That's absolutely right. And just before I come to you, interesting comment, because I'm dealing with quite a lot of hydrogen at the moment, and one of the things that's going on is hydrogen pilot trials and various other things. And the idea that the domestic consumer might change and switch to hydrogen. And what's been shown to be very, very clear is if you force people to do things, it really isn't going to work. You've got to persuade them. So I think that's a really big point. Lily.
Thank you. So I think where we're going to see a lot of this succeed, or where the early adopters at a macro scale are going to be cities, and I think we know that because we can see some of that. So I guess the one thing that's really on my mind, which is very sort of parochial, but is how do we secure the progress that we've made in London into the longer term? So very tenuous funding situations with cities, particularly London, only 12 months worth of funding ahead. So, we can't deliver a journey to net zero, be it 2030 or 2050, unless we know that we can really invest in getting that city on that journey. And that will build the kinds of industry we need, not just for London, but in many places across Britain. So it does require that longer term commitment to enable the action we need to take now.
That's great. Look, thank you very, very much, panel. That's absolutely fantastic. It's a great start to the day. Thank you for all of your questions again, for listening in. We're going to move on to the next panel now, and your chair for that is Dr. Wolfgang Schuster from the Connected Places Catapult. And so I'd like to invite him onto the stage with the panel, and we will take our leave. There's probably a sort of 2-minute changeover, so bear with us on that. But thank you again. And can we have a round of applause for the panel?